It's interesting, Father Tim's introduction touches on a few things, and I'll touch on it a little bit later, but it's interesting when Father Arturo Sosa, who's the Father General of the Jesuits, was in the country, he and I had a chance to talk about the Doctrine of Discovery. So we had, I'll talk a little about that. Was going to mention, but since you mentioned Father Arturo, for me, this is more of a conversation with you this morning. And it's probably a conversation, it's interesting what Father Tim said about his staff, about coming to know really what this doctrine of discovery is, because as he mentioned, well, it did impact their lives. And, I would probably have to say the same thing. But as I was preparing this talk, I began to think, though, that I came to know the doctrine of discovery really when I was a teenager, and I didn't know it. Because I don't know if any of you remember, I'm going to go back to 1977, but if some of you might remember Moss Lake, and there was a little bit of a controversy regarding the land at Moss Lake, and it involved the Mohawk tribe, and actually Mario Cuomo at the time was the Secretary of State. And so the solution came that the Indians who were, the Mohawk Indians who were at Moss Lake, were granted a new tract of land. Well, the tract of land happened to be in my hometown, where I grew up. And so I remember all of a sudden, just to give you a little background, all of a sudden land that I had been used to snowmobiling on, a lake I had gone fishing on and everything, all of a sudden it was restricted. But even more what was interesting is part of that land actually belonged to my great aunt and uncle. And so some of that, I knew the land, all that really they inherited quite well, because there was a sugar bush, I had been in the sugar bush, I had walked the land, so it was interesting that all of a sudden I wasn't welcome on that land anymore. And I can remember at first it was like, well, that was so long ago, why is this happening now? And at first there was a lot of tension, a lot of mistrust. Now, 77, so we're almost 40 years later. I almost hate to say that, maybe 50 years, 40 at least. But you talk about the difference, because now it's all just it's all one community, and there are different things. I mean, it's funny to say in one way, but it's all part of it. But there's a wellness center, there's a golf course, there of course is the bingo hall, and all that, and then there is the gas. But all of a sudden it's just, there's very much, there's no more, the tension is not there any longer. It's just like one community. And one community walking two paths. Now I want you to keep that in mind. One community walking two paths, because towards the end, that'll come into what I want to say, where we go with this doctrine of discovery. So anyway, so that was my introduction, whether I knew it or not. And I didn't think too much more of it until I came to Syracuse, where I began I don't think I was in Syracuse 6 months, even before COVID, when Father David McCallum, who's a Jesuit, introduced me to what the dialogue that was happening with the Onondaga Nation, with the Haudenosaunee, regarding the doctrine of discovery. And I have to be honest with you, even at that point, I really didn't know that much about it. I was still like, okay. And again, part of the whole thing is that, and we'll talk about that a little bit this morning, for many people, and even in the church, that doctrine formally has been rescinded. But let me use that word formally, okay? Because there's a difference, and I'm going to talk about the difference that I've learned in my own relationship with the Onondaga Nation. But why also is the doctrine of discovery so much on our radar today? Well, because in the political world, in the world of even of the courts, principles that are backed by the doctrine of discovery are still being used. Legal precedents, and some in this country dating back to John Marshall, but used just as recently as 2005 by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the case involving another tribe in my diocese, the Oneidas. Okay, so it's still involved there, and then it's also involved in other parts of the world. Wonderful book I was reading, because I got to admit, I was like, what am I supposed to say to people? What am I supposed to talk about when I'm with you today? And so, but it gives me an opportunity to do more reading, which I love to do anyways. But I've been reading Sarah Augustine's book, The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus and Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery. And just to give you a thing about Sarah's very interesting because she comes from the Mennonite tradition. But she's been working with the World Council of Churches. And what's very interesting is her own journey with this, especially as it's found in the nation of Suriname, which is in Central America. Again, colonized by the Dutch. Now, what's very interesting about the Dutch is that the Haudenosaunee, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, has a treaty called the Two Paths, or the Two Rows. It was made with the Dutch. So it's interesting that the connection with Sarah is that the nation she's most familiar with, it also had Dutch settlers. But what's interesting about her experience is that writing as a Christian, writing as a Mennonite, she also talks about what the doctrine of discovery is still doing in that nation today. And so we'll talk about that too. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But again, why is all of this important? Well, because as one commentator has written, it said, and this is referring specifically to the Catholic Church and to the Vatican as per se, it says Vatican relations with indigenous peoples can't fully heal until, whether it's Pope Francis or another pope, confronts the lingering anger over the doctrine's unilateral claim to the lands inhabited by non-Christian tribes. And in a moment I'll define really what the doctrine of discovery is. But that is, for me, why I put that there in my conversation with you is, that's what got me thinking about the doctrine of discovery even more, is a lingering anger. A lingering anger. And we prayed it, the prayer of this morning was so beautiful because it talked about dominance, talked about arrogance, and that's what, especially in my own relationship with the chiefs of the Haudenosaunee, of the Onondaga, they've been able to express that to me. And that's one of the stumbling blocks to reconciliation at times. And yet, as we will see, a bridge to that reconciliation, or a path to that reconciliation, is also working on understanding one another. But I'll get to that a little bit later. But before we get there, let me talk about the two sides of the doctrine of discovery, at least where it stands as it's looked upon. Well, first of all, let me just tell you what the doctrine of discovery is in a nutshell. In a nutshell, and it's formed by different, they would call them papal bulls, okay? which at the time, and so we're talking, just to give you a time period, we're talking just right around 1492. Okay, so we're talking around that, what they often call the Age of Discovery. And so just around that time, papal bulls were issued. And again, that was the time of Christendom. So what the Pope said was law. Okay, so that's what's important to understand. What the Pope said was law. Sarah, in her book, notes that as well. And so what the Doctrine of Discovery was it's a legal principle, and this is what's important, and this is what it will connect it to our own history, right down to the present age. A legal principle which has passed from church law into common law. Okay? It's passed from church law into common law. And it granted the European discovering powers a kind of unrestricted sovereignty over the lands and peoples they discovered. And as I noted, it began with a series of papal bulls issued by Popes Nicholas V and Alexander VI before and just after Columbus returned from his first contact with the Americas. And so, the first one noted, and it's attributed to Nicholas V, and it's given the dates 15. There's a couple of dates that were not agreeing. One was 1452 or 1455, but the document's called Dum Diversus. And basically what it is that Nicholas V gives license to the Portuguese king Alfonso, a license, and notice the word, a license, okay, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue the people in the new lands discovered. Okay? And then it's followed by, in 1493, Alexander VI, who established, and again, it's a document called Inter Caetera, which is again to establish dominions leading to the baptism of the natives. Now, why? Why was the church doing this? Well, it was, of course, it was. Let me just. This is a 19th century legal scholar who describes the process that I've just talked about in the following way. It says, Christendom is now the unity, of which Christ's vicar on earth is the head. And the Crusaders give a practical direction to this idea. While on the theoretical side, at a later date, it's worked out by the Spanish and Dutch jurists. Notice the Dutch are involved in this. They divide mankind into 1 believers, 2 infidels and heretics, and 3 heathens. International law, which is tacitly or expressly assumed to be the private civil law of Rome, applies to the first. Toward the second category, war is normal and proper attitude. And so, and as to the third, if they do not at once accept the gospel when offered, war is justifiable. So you see, it was almost a declaration of war. And it was, call it, what has been called in other times, a war religion. Okay? And the big thing was, and the way they did this was this thing of being called the requirement, or in Italian it was the requirimento, which was a document read to the indigenous people, and that they were notified that they were to submit to the rule of the king and queen, because the sovereigns had been assigned the legal rulers by the representative of God, the Pope, and the native people were asked in the requirement to submit to this rule. If they would not, the consequences would be dire, as we've been talking about. But in order to understand this a bit, there were three central concepts to this idea of the requirement. That was, one, the Creator God has sent members of the church who are empowered to make things happen in the lands of indigenous people. Okay, so we're there to improve things, as they would sometimes see themselves. Indigenous peoples are subordinate and must submit to the authority of missionaries. And three, missionaries are frequently the emissaries of a political power in league with the state. Okay, and those are things that the indigenous people have certainly expressed. And as I will share with you in a moment, that is not the view of all missionaries of the day. But again, as we see, and we'll just discuss even more, as noted, this religious, these are going to fly, that's why I'm doing that. But as you notice, this precedent set by the Bishop of Rome, as it says, has made its way into common law. And so even, as I've noted already, in judicial decisions, it's being used today. And so, and it also has an impact on today, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Where I'll give you an example of that was in the Pope's visit to Quebec. Okay? But let me just stop. Any questions so far? You don't have to listen to my voice all day. So, good.
What you said recently struck me. It really seems as though the Doctrine of Discovery is a corollary of Christian just warfare. Would you say that?
Yeah, I think it was meant to justify what was happening. So yeah, it was meant to justify why they were taking. They were using what they saw, because again, notice the whole idea. They were going to improve.
Yeah.
They were going to improve. They were going to improve the life of the indigenous. Okay. Again, that I know that sounds maybe a little strange to us in some ways, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe, as I'm suggesting here, maybe it happens in the world today, and I'll give you a couple of examples as we go on.
Why has it taken the church so long to come to this point where the Doctrine of Discovery is really examined and the effects of this happening?
Well, I think even Sarah Augustine in her book would say it's been, what we're seeing is, and I was just going to talk about this in a minute, the doctrine itself was repealed. And repealed not long, it was repealed within about 100 years after it had been issued by those two previous popes. The thing is, as sometimes happens, the effects are already being felt. And I don't think people recognized the effects. And so that's why, in one way, and because it's interesting, Sarah, in her dealing with the World Council of Churches, was running up against a certain barrier also, because it was like, okay, this is in the past, it was rescinded, but they weren't seeing, it's not that people weren't necessarily seeing how it was affecting people today. And I think that was all part of it. Okay?
Or how it was affecting them even then?
Or then, and again, there can be blinders, like even the missionaries. The missionaries themselves, like I say, many were good people. They were trying to really help, but again, in helping people, sometimes they thought they had the better answer, and things like that. Fred, did you?
Yeah, I was wondering, certainly the formal response of the church to be it was repealed.
Right.
But obviously, as you say, it became part of legal law.
Right.
Or whatever. What seems, what would your guess be on, at least to date, why Pope Francis would obviously be very well attuned to the Doctrine of Discovery coming from Argentina, why he hasn't publicly taken the step to remind people that this isn't, like in Quebec, New York City, when he was there with the indigenous leaders. What do you think is the hesitancy for the church to just simply reiterate this is not a teaching of the church, and yet it doesn't seem to be coming through at all?
Right. Well, let me come to that in a minute as I continue my talk, because that's part of it, okay? So I'll answer your question hopefully as we continue.
Was there any disagreement even at the time when it was promulgated by other religions and other cultures?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that right now. Okay? Okay. Let me just see where I'm at here in the notes here. All right, let me go back to a minute, because I said there's a second side to this doctrine of discovery, and you almost have to do the contrast before I can get to where we're at the present. Because the other side of this is that the doctrine of discovery. Now remember, I gave you the dates just to be correct. I gave you the date like 1452 and then 1493. Well, in 1437, Pope Paul III repudiated the doctrine of discovery. Okay? So even as early as 1537, Paul III had repudiated that doctrine. It was the doctrine that the document issued was called, the bull was Sublimus Dei. And what's interesting is that in the document, in the words of Paul III, it attributed all the talk of enslaving and exploitation to the enemy of the human race. Okay? So, as early as 100 years after the promulgation of the doctrine, Paul III had publicly denounced the doctrine. But here's the catch, because you might be wondering, well, why didn't it get out there? Well, there's two reasons. One reason is, and this is a historical thing, but it appears that it never was published outside the Vatican. Okay? That it never got published outside the Vatican. Now, we can only speculate at the time why that might have happened, but I'm sure they're probably called the rulers of Spain and France and other places that just didn't want it promulgated. So that's one thing. But on a practical side, just to show you where that there was outcry, there was a Spanish Dominican friar by the name of Bartolomeo de las Casas. And Bartolomeo was a great defender of the indigenous people. But what's very interesting is his own journey of discovery, in the sense of what this doctrine of discovery meant, was actually his own experience at first as a missionary, coming to the New World, so to speak, and seeing how the indigenous people were treated. And for him, he made a trip, he went back to Spain, but he began to really, really rail against the treatment and what he saw as happening. And so he's one example of, no, there were people who were railing against what was going on. Another one whose feast day we just celebrated was Peter Claver. Peter Claver, in his own work with the slaves and his own account, he worked very closely, and again, a Spanish Jesuit in this case, who worked very closely to the indigenous people. And again, he saw part of it as wanting to share the faith with them. But again, what was very primary, first and foremost, was his own care for them. Okay? So why? Why then did this not happen? Why, although it appears that the doctrine was repudiated in 1537, why are we still talking about it today? Well, and this is one of the best answers that I've seen, because let's go back to this whole idea of about the church's response. I mean, there have been popes who have begged forgiveness for the sins against the indigenous, particularly John Paul II in 1992 when he went to Hispaniola, and also with in 2002 on March the 12th, or I should say March the 12th, 2000 itself, during the Great Jubilee, he particularly begged forgiveness for the sins of the church during the Spanish conquest, and also committed in the name of the church, but during this time of colonization. So he did talk about it. And also Pope Francis, and we'll get to Pope Francis in a minute. But what's interesting, in 2007, there was also a group of indigenous people who met with Archbishop Celestino Migliore, and who was the permanent observer of the Holy See at that time to the UN. And what was interesting is that they had presented him with their case, and he actually did write back to them. But the letter informing the Native Americans who had met with him over these concerns, what he wrote about and what he said is that subsequent papal bulls had abrogated the ones they wanted revoked, including a bull from 1537, the one I mentioned to you, that explicitly forbade the enslaving Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians, and there was no need to take further action. Okay, so in one mind, it would seem, as Archbishop Migliore, and I have to be honest with you, some others would say, well, it's already been taken care of. But here's the problem. What the problem is, it's also summed up in Migliore's reference to the doctrines interlacing, in this case with U.S. law. The refutation of this doctrine is therefore now under the competence of American politicians, legislators, lawyers, and legal historians. And so, in one way, what they're saying is, look, we have repudiated this, the popes have talked about this, but where it lies now is that the legal system has to repudiate it. The legal system has to stop using it, so to speak. And as one commentator said, it's so wrapped up in law now, and law has become so divorced from religion, in Western societies at least, that I can't even read my own writing, that the courts don't think, the courts, I don't think, are really going to care what the Catholic Church says. Okay? So I think that is one of the interesting little dimensions here, is that even as the Church does speak about this, it's not that the courts are going to care one way or another what's said. Okay? Again, as I said, it has been used, at least the principles associated, even by someone like Justice Ginsburg in 2005, so what, 17 years ago. So anyways, I think that's important to note. And so you might be saying to me, okay, Bishop Doug, why then are we talking about this morning. Because for me, there still is a need. There's still a need, even if we can't, I guess we say, even if we can't turn back history, we can move forward. And part of the moving forward has to be a healing. It has to be a healing, and it has to be a healing based on even gestures, if you want to call it that. But gestures that show that what has taken place should never happen again. What's interesting, and this I saw happen in Quebec City, and this happens particularly right now with the Canadian government, but it's also would apply, I think, to the U.S. and it applies in South America. What's interesting is the Canadian government, I don't know if you caught when the Pope was in Quebec City and he was addressing the Prime Minister and the diplomats, but the Prime Minister kept saying, we need the church as an institution to apologize what it did in the schools, in the boarding schools. What was interesting, lacking in that moment, was they were government boarding schools. and so there's this slight interaction between state and religion where the state almost wants to put itself above what has happened, but really it was the state enforcing this, in this case, this enculturation that would strip the Indian of their language, of everything. Okay? And if you just permit me for a minute, because I have to get on my little thing here. What I want to make reference to, and that's why I'm going to this thing, I want to make reference to the Holy Father's response to that, because he says something very interesting in that moment. And I got the wrong month. It was the end of July he was there. I want you to listen. This is part of the Pope's speech. He's using the image of the maple leaf, by the way, in this speech. And he says, the large size of maple leaves, which absorb polluted air. I'm not saying it's polluting the air, but it's kind of funny, that horn sound. The large size of the maple leaves, which absorb polluted air and in turn give out oxygen, invite us to marvel at the beauty of creation and to appreciate the wholesome values present in the indigenous cultures. They can inspire us all and help to heal harmful tendencies to exploitation. Exploiting creation, relationships, time, and basing human activity solely on what proves useful and profitable. These vital teachings, however, were violently opposed in the past. I think above all of the policies of assimilation and enfranchisement, also involving the residential school system, which harm many indigenous families by undermining their language, culture, and worldview. In that deplorable system, promoted by governmental authorities of the time, different local Catholic institutions had a part. For this reason, I express my deep shame and sorrow, and together with the bishops of this country, I renew my request for forgiveness for the wrong done by so many Christians to the indigenous peoples. It is tragic when some believers, as happened in that period of history, conform themselves to the conventions of the world rather than to the gospel. The Christian faith has played an essential role in shaping the highest ideals of Canada, characterized by the desire to build a country for all its people. At the same time, it is necessary in admitting our faults to work together to accomplish a goal that I know all of you share, to promote the legitimate rights of the native populations and to favor processes of healing and reconciliation between them and the non-indigenous people of the country. That is reflected in the commitment to respond in a fitting way to the appeals of the Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, as well as in the concern to acknowledge the gifts and rights of the native people. Let me go on. And again, this actually quote is coming from when he was in the Amazon, when he was in Amazonia. He said, "The history of suffering and contempt, the fruit of the colonizing mentality, does not heal easily. Indeed, it should make us realize that colonization has not ended. In many places, it has been transformed, disguised, and concealed. This is the case with the forms of ideological colonization. In the past, the colonist mentality disregarded the concrete life of people and imposed certain predetermined cultural models. Yet today, too, there are a number of forms of ideological colonization that clash with the reality of life, stifle the natural attachment of peoples to their values, and attempt to uproot their traditions, history, and religious ties. This mentality, presumptuously thinking that the dark pages of history have been left behind, becomes open to the cancel culture that would judge the past purely on the basis of certain contemporary categories. The result is a cultural fashion that levels everything out, makes everything equal, proves intolerant of differences, and concentrates on the present moment, on the needs and rights of individuals, while frequently neglecting their duties with regard to the most weak and vulnerable of our brothers and sisters, the poor, the migrants, the elderly, the sick, the unborn. They are the forgotten ones in affluent societies. They are the ones who, amid general indifference, are cast aside like dry leaves to be burnt." But notice what he's talking about, which I thought was an interesting response to both, particularly to Canada, but also to the Western world. In the sense, he talked about the idea of that colonization being an ideological colonization. That in one way, whether it's the United States or whatever, we think we have the better answer for people in other parts of the world. So.
Part of your speech is on the
Oh, okay. So it's very interesting that Pope Francis happens to, in responding to the criticism that the church needs to step up and apologize, and again, we hear those words. Now, the question remains, why not specifically talk about the Doctrine of Discovery? The only answer I can give at this time, and the only answer that I've been given, is that because the church has. The church has spoken out on it. The church has, down even now with Pope Francis, the church has talked about, they have repudiated the doctrine. And in fact, in one conversation I had, that I was having, the person was surprised that I was saying that we probably need to do something with the doctrine. They said, well, it doesn't exist. It doesn't have any meaning anymore. And I said, to us, we think. I said, and see, this is the point I'm getting to, as you get tired of listening to me. But this is the point that I'm getting to, in the sense that for us, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, that's been repudiated. It no longer exists. But as Pope Francis alluded to in his talk, its ramifications are still being felt in the world today. For instance, down in, using Sarah Augustine, to give you just an example of another part of the world, down in Suriname, which I've talked about, there are still rainforests that have been, and there's gold deposits. Well, just imagine what they're inviting missionaries to do. They're inviting the missionaries to go in and to gather these tribal people into closer communities so that they can be served. But in gathering them into closer communities, what else is going on? Their land is being taken. Okay? And their land is being taken. And so that's all part, again, of what they see is happening. And in fact, Sarah talks about in her book about a conversation when she was simply there to observe a meeting happening in one of these tribal villages. She was there sort of as a sociologist to see the effects all this was happening. Well, at one time, or at one point, one of the village matriarchs looks at her, "Are you going to help us?" And at that moment, Sarah's like, almost like, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" And she said, "Either you're here to help us or not." Okay? And that leads me to sort of also something that Sarah was told, and that was the idea that we don't need help, we need relatives. We don't need help, we need relatives. We need people who are willing to walk with us. And in fact, the person who said that to her, this was at a UN conference where she was told, but the person who said that also said, "There was a creator of earth among us before the Western story came. Mission should be an exchange of good news, a theology of life." Think of those words. There was a creator of earth among us before the Western story came. Mission should be an exchange of good news and a theology of life. And that is also at the heart of Sarah's book, and I would say also of my experience. It really comes down to the fact of if we really believe in the dignity and the sanctity of human life, it's very much how we walk with one another. And where I've been taught this, and again, this is my own personal reflections now, but I've really come to know this through my limited contact with the Onondaga Nation, with the Haudenosaunee. But I've had a meeting with the chiefs, and one of the things the chiefs brought to me, because I wanted to listen to them, and so I wanted them to come and share their story with me. And one of the things they brought me was one of the wampums. And the wampum, of course, is a belt, but it's more than a belt, it's a treaty, actually. And the wampum they brought to me was the wampum some refer to as the two rows, but it's also called the two paths. And actually, this wampum, again, we're talking of all things, this was with the Dutch. The Haudenosaunee, of course, being in central New York, but this was a treaty they did with the Dutch in the 17th century. And what it was meant to be was a model of relationship between peoples. And what the white field, the belt itself is like a white field. Originally it was done in shells. So it's white shells. And that is meant to signify peace and friendly relationship. The purple rows, which there were two of, separate by equal paths of two sovereign nations. Think of that. Even at that point, even when people had come among them, what they wanted most at that moment was to bring about this peace, was this peaceful coexistence. And in fact, the words of the treaty are like this. You say that you are our father and son. We say we will not be like father and son, but like brothers. This wampum confirms our words. Okay? We're not going to be like father and son. We're going to be brothers. And the two paths, we also notice, also symbolize, or two vessels traveling down the same river together. Notice the image of water here. We shall each travel the river together, side by side, but in our own boat. Neither of us will make compulsory laws or interfere in the eternal affairs of the other. Neither of us will try to steer the other's vessel. Okay? And I'll, in a moment, I'll share with you words that actually Pope Francis just spoke in Kazakhstan this week regarding it. But for me, just to share with you a personal experience, is in meeting with the chiefs of the Onondaga tribe, there are, and again, this is how this colors my perspective on the Doctrine of Discovery, there's still a lot of hurt. And it's not even over the Doctrine of Discovery. To be honest with you, the hurt comes from the fact, and I'm talking this happened in the 1600s, that they asked if a Catholic priest might come from then in Quebec, to be part of their community. They wanted to invite a Jesuit, a missionary, to come to be part of their community. Basically, whether it was the government leader or whatever from Quebec, basically said to them, you're not worth it. Okay? Now, you might be surprised, you might not be surprised, that those hurt feelings exist to today. Because I had the chief say to me, and this is the chief saying to me, 2022, you know, Bishop, there will never be a Catholic church on our land. Okay? And I respect him for that. I understand the deep hurt there. But at the same time, as we've come already, and it's funny in our conversation because there are many, there's a richness. And I should tell you, part of this journey, I've been able not only to do myself now, but myself and the Episcopal Bishop Dee Miller, or Dee, I'm not saying her last name right, but Bishop Dee, and then Bishop Miller, who's the Lutheran Bishop, Lee, we have all become good friends. And in fact, to the point that we have lunch together once a month, just to talk about things. And they have joined me. The day of when the Doctrine of Discovery had first been promulgated, that day in May 5th, I believe, we all went to the cultural center up on Onondaga Park to tour the facility, and we were given a tour, and it was shared with us. And so we have a common. In fact, we're going to be meeting next week, or beginning of October, I guess, but to talk about where do we want to go. But what's interesting is, again, why I'm sharing that with you is that this idea, but particularly the idea, is to listen to one another. To listen to one another. And Sarah says it, and I'm not going to be able to find it right now, but that is one of the big things is, well, no, actually it comes from the Kazakhstan. Let me go to the Pope's speech. But that's where it wasn't with Sarah. Okay. Just so you know this, and I don't know if I'm saying this Kazakhstan poet right. It's either Abai or Abai. It's A-B-I. Anyways, and he was a poet that lived from 1845 to 1904. Well, the Pope references him in this speech. Okay. But here's what he said, and this I think can help us, and then I'd be glad to try to further answer questions. But this is what the Pope said just this week regarding religion and in the world. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, the world expects us to be examples of souls alive and minds clear. It looks to us for an authentic religiosity. It's time to realize that the fundamentalism defiles and corrupts every creed. Time for open and compassionate hearts. It's also time to consign to the history books the kind of talk that for all too long, here and elsewhere, has led to distrust and contempt for religion, as if it were a destabilizing force in modern society. These lands are all too familiar with the legacy of decades of state-imposed atheism, that oppressive and stifling mentality for which the mere mention of the word religion was greeted with embarrassed silence. Religion is not a problem, but a part of the solution for a more harmonious life in society. The pursuit of transcendence and the sacred value of fraternity can inspire and illumine the decisions that need to be made amid the geopolitical, social, economic, ecological, but fundamentally spiritual crises that many modern institutions, including democracies, are presently experiencing, to the detriment of security and concord among peoples. We need religion in order to respond to the thirst for world peace and the thirst for the infinite that dwells in the heart of each man and woman. For this reason, an essential condition for genuinely human and integral development is religious freedom. Brothers and sisters, we are free. Our Creator stepped aside for us in a manner of speaking. He limited His absolute freedom in order to enable us, His creatures, to be free. How can we then presume to coerce our brothers and sisters in His name? As believers and worshippers, Abai once again tells us, we must not claim that we can force others to believe and worship. Religious freedom is a basic, primary, and inalienable right needing to be promoted everywhere, one that may not be restricted merely to freedom of worship. Each person has the right to render public testimony to his or her own creed, proposing it without ever imposing it. This is the correct method of preaching, as opposed to proselytism and indoctrination, from which we are called to step back. To relegate to the private sphere our most important beliefs in life would be to deprive society of an immense treasure. On the other hand, to work for society marked by the respectful coexistence of religious, ethnic, and cultural differences is the best way to enhance the distinctive features of each, to bring people together while respecting their diversity, and to promote their loftiest aspirations without compromising their vitality. In this way, so anyways, he goes on, but then later on, I'm just looking here for a definition he gives, which I thought was